In this module, we look at the cost approach to valuation. Now, I tend to think that for most people, the cost approach would seem to be the most sensible, in that it's based on the idea that the value of a thing can be worked out by adding together the value of its parts. And that's simply what the cost approach is. However, what you'll find when you read through the study guide in detail is that the cost approach is not considered to be very reliable. I would say that ultimately this is because property gets its value from its utility, from the price that someone is willing to pay to occupy it, say as a tenant or as an owner-occupier, rather than simply in terms of what its actual cost is. Let's move now to the approach itself. What I'm going to do in this introduction is simply take you through the main points, the headings if you like, but it's really then a matter of reading through the study guide in detail and the other resources that are listed in the study guide. The nice thing about the cost approach is that it is based on a very simple and straightforward equation, and that is that the property value is equal to the land value plus the cost of improvements less the depreciation to those improvements. By the way, in this equation, the C minus D term is often referred to as the depreciated replacement cost, and we use that expression in many places, especially in plant and machinery valuation. As we go through to get the property value, the first thing we start with is the valuation of the land. And so the question is, how do we value the land? Well, curiously, even though this approach is distinct from the comparable sales method, we use that method to value the land where we can. And so you would use comparable sales of vacant land to give you the land value. That's nice if you're in an area where there is some vacant land or virtually vacant land, but it's not always the case, and especially as urban areas become more developed, vacant land sales become relatively rare. And so the alternate method, which is intended to be considered as an alternate method, it is inferior because of the extra number of assumptions and estimations that are involved. It's what's known as the allocation or abstraction method. Now, if you look closely at the equation which the allocation method of land valuation uses, you'll find that it's no more than the cost approach reorganized. Rather than having the property value as the subject of the equation, we have the land value. But we're really applying this to other nearby or comparable parcels of land, which will be recent sales. When you start to look at the reliance of the cost approach on comparable sales, a lot of people get confused and think that in fact the cost approach is simply a variant of the sales approach, the comparable sales approach. In fact, we consider it as a distinct method because of the focus on cost and depreciation. So be very wary. Even though we're using a lot of comparable sales data, and you need that, it's still not considered to be a comparable sales method. And this is because of the element of cost and depreciation that sneak in. However, when you're applying it, to get comparable land values, you often have to use the cost approach equation kind of in reverse in order to get comparable land sales. The third method, in fact there are actually more methods than this for valuing land, but these are the three main ones. The third approach is the residual land value. Now, you have to be a little bit wary with this because it really is only for development land, and so you have to be a bit cautious when you apply it, and in fact what conditions you apply it to make sure it is really like for like. But it's in there as a third option. When we move now to estimation of costs, there are a number of variables in here. The first question is, are we looking at the costs to reproduce the improvements? And by the way, we're looking specifically at the major improvements when we talk about estimation of costs. To reproduce them means that if the original building is made with some older form of construction technique, and the extreme probably is stone, do we reproduce it with a building to do the same job using exactly the same materials? Well, in some cases, reproduction costs are hideously expensive, and we may not even want to use them. For instance, would we want to use timber windows with all of the problems that they bring in if we could avoid it? And so reproduction is sometimes necessary, especially with heritage buildings, but more likely replacement is going to be what we're going to be looking at in cost. Replace, in other words, to build a building which will give comparable amount of space and utility, but using the current building methods. But there's a question we have to ask right at the very outset, because on occasions reproduction may be the more likely. How do we estimate costs? Well, you can see there are a number, almost half a dozen different major types. We go over that in the study guide in detail. It's really a combination between the first four, which all come down to local knowledge, and the fifth one, which is building cost manuals. Building cost manuals, we supply the Rawlinson's construction cost guide through the library. There's also an online reading from Rawlinson's that you're able to get as part of this module. That's important to look at because you'll find that useful for the assignment. It's also good to open up the excerpt from Rawlinson's, which is there, just to get a feel for what it provides. By the way, Rawlinson's comes as many, many hundreds of pages of quantity surveying variables. We're only giving you a few score, 50 or 60 pages or something. So don't think that what's online able to be downloaded as part of the module is in fact all of Rawlinson's. There's a lot more. What I've put online for you is the simplest approach, or the simplest part of the Rawlinson's to get your head around. Now, in practice, what do people use? Well, valuers in the field tend to use a combination of the above. It's a matter of how big and how experienced you and your firm are as to how much local information you have, and also the type of project. When valuers have been surveyed to get an idea of what estimation methods they use, the most common is building cost manuals. So they reach for their Rawlinson's or one of the other comparable building cost manuals. And for our assignment, for the purposes of this course, using the information in what's available online from the library, from the Rawlinson's excerpt, is quite acceptable. You don't need to go into actually personally talking to builders and so on. The last element in the equation is the depreciation, or the cost adjustments. Now, when we look closely at property, we find that it's useful to break depreciation up into three different types. It makes it easier to evaluate because you can understand where it's coming from and the dynamics of it. Depreciation is the technical term for the loss in value over time as a result of something not doing its job as well as it did at the very beginning. The three types of depreciation are physical depreciation. This is physical wear and tear. The house or the building, whatever it is wearing out. Basically, the roof is beginning to leak, the floor might have holes in it, whatever. Physical depreciation. Physical depreciation can be broken into depreciation or wear and tear that is capable of being fixed and that which is not. In the study guide, we take that into considerably more depth and detail, so you're welcome to read that there. The second version, or the second type of depreciation, is functional depreciation. Functional depreciation would be something like the usefulness of a stable at the back of a large home. It may have been very useful when people were getting around in horse and carts, but there are many things inside a stable that aren't really that useful if you're trying to garage a motor car. There are many other examples of functional depreciation. Functional depreciation tends to be more common in income-producing buildings, especially industrial and commercial buildings. Say you might have an office building which is not built for air conditioning, so the air conditioning plant is a bit of a add-on. It might be a bit clunky and so on. So that would give you functional depreciation, even though it might be humming along very well. So physically it may not be depreciated, but functionally you may not want to look at it. The third type of depreciation is economic depreciation. Economic depreciation comes not from anything to do with the physical character of the building, but rather its situation in the community. For instance, a service station or a motel in a town which is on a main road, and the main road is bypassed by a motorway. The motel is not going to get very many guests because people speed along the motorway. Likewise, the service station is not going to sell nearly as much petrol to the locals. Economic depreciation is very hard to control because it largely comes as a result of the externalities to the property. To compute depreciation, again, we go to the comparable properties. In domestic valuations, so for houses, you can look at comparable properties and analyse them back using the equation that we have here, which again you will observe is really nothing more than a rearrangement of the cost approach equation in the first place. Again, we're using comparable sales in order to analyse back to the variable that we're interested in. So that's fairly straightforward. We put all that together once we have the land, the cost and the depreciation, and that gives us the value of the property. Now, in amongst all of that, the valuation of all three of those variables tends to be rather open to challenge and so on. It's not as precisely measurable as it may appear by putting equations up on a piece of paper. And the reason for that is that the construction costs are extraordinarily varied. It's very hard to say that a building 10 years ago, you can't say that you really understand its costs and precisely what it would cost to replace today. The same thing with the depreciation, exactly how much depreciation, what are the parameters of depreciation. It opens up quite a minefield for subjective estimation and therefore risk to the valuer being found to be not doing their job properly. And so the cost approach generally is used only as a check method, and the reason for that is that there are so many estimates involved that it's not nearly as reliable an approach as the others. You do use the cost approach on occasions where the other approaches are not applicable for whatever reason, and you can go to the study guide to see examples of that. Let's move now to insurance valuation. Insurance valuation is dealt with as part of this module because it really has a focus on the costs to replace, reinstate, whatever, the main improvements. Because usually you insure your house, you don't insure your property, unless you may have some very special other buildings or something, but you don't tend to insure your paling fence. So there's a focus on the main buildings. You need to check the conditions in the insurance policy before you take on an insurance valuation, because there's quite a difference in the different policies between, let's say, reinstatement, which is replacing the improvements, the house, new for old, compared to indemnity, which is to replace with the same. So if you've got a 20-year-old house, the insurer only has to replace it with the equivalent of a 20-year-old house. And so that's a lot cheaper. The premium is cheaper, but also what you get if an airplane does fly into your house is not nearly the same as the reinstatement policy. So you need to check that. Reinstatement obviously is more popular. The cost difference is not that great, and it ends up with a lot less trauma in the event of having to use the insurance. In addition to checking the conditions of the policy itself, there are also a couple of major issues that need to be considered when you're attempting insurance valuation. You're basically doing the similar things to the cost approach in that you're usually called upon to look at the question of the cost to construct, the improvements being insured, but there are extra elements in the insurance situation. If an airplane flies into the house and it's demolished or whatever happens, it burns down. There's also the matter of cleaning up the site, which is often costly, and demolition if there's only partial destruction of the improvements. And so that's extra cost, so you need to estimate those. You can estimate those from the same kind of methods that you use for estimating your construction costs. So Rawlinson's will have demolition estimates and so on, also inquiries with local builders and so on. The second thing that must be considered for insurance valuation is that most valuation is valued at the time of the valuation exercise, and that usually is dated to be the date of inspection. However, with insurance, the valuation is a little bit different. The insurer must be able to reinstate or indemnify, replace with the same, any time during the length of the policy. And so if you're doing a valuation today for a policy which is going to begin in 2 months' time, and it might run for 12 months, but then on the very last day of the policy, the house burns down, but then it takes another 6 months by the time everything is sorted out and the house is rebuilt, you're looking at what could be getting close to 2 years into the future that the insurance valuation must consider. And so price escalations during that time must be considered as part of the valuation. And so if a house costs, let's say, $200,000 to build today, you might have to add whatever the building price index is for the estimate of the last point at which the money is going to have to be paid. So you've got to look at the last day of the insurance policy plus an allowance for the time of reconstruction and so on. And so 200,000 might look more like 250. By the time you put demolition and site cleanup, it might be looking at about 300,000. And so to get a $200,000 house, might be brand new today, and it's going to be insured, the insurance value for it might be considerably more. Okay, that takes us through the module. Obviously, this is only a very short summary of the study guide, and so it's now a matter of going to the guide and working through that.